Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and I've got a couple bins that are now, today, 100 days of age. And they're the ones that are down here on the floor, side by side. They're the European nightcrawler bins that have been fed 8 times so far now. And 8 days have passed since their last feeding. In most cases, I would probably wait more than just 8 days between feedings. But hey, since it's their 100 days in service, it seemed like a good day just to come on out and commemorate their milestone age date and give them some food. So I'm going to get them up on the bench and get them fed. So let's get started. As you can see, as bedding today, the systems are each going to get a variety of very colorful napkins. Not one, but 2 orange napkins, a yellow one and a colorful white one go for each one. I've also got replacement top coverings. I doubt that they're going to need them necessarily because, well, one of them just got a replacement top covering last week. And I just figured I would reuse that top covering paper that's already been here in the system for the past 8 days. This one, to be exact. This was the one we put in here brand new last time. I just figured we'd use that as bedding as well, along with all those napkins. I've got replacement top covering leaf matter too. So, you know what? I gotta put on a glove. Alright, we'll just set this piece of newspaper aside until we're ready to use it as bedding. It's got a nice moisture content to it, so hopefully that's a sign of the overall moisture level of the bin throughout. Having a plastic covering like we have here is usually a good way to keep most of the moisture in the system down and prevent it from evaporating. Even the material on the very edges where that plastic didn't really reach around to, yeah, this stuff out here is a little bit dry, but for the most part the top is fairly damp too, lending itself hopefully to some worm traffic rather than letting it just become a no man's land or no worms land. So you can see a lot of the types of bedding that I use here, not only those leafy sprinklings across the top, now you're starting to see some of my shredded paper and cardboard. I just figured today we would try to do away with some of my little collection of colorful napkins here rather than breaking out my prepared bedding. And besides that, we're going to be replenishing the top surface with new leaves too. This is an old banana stem. Almost fell apart in my hands when I touched it. All the fibers just sort of detached from each other, and there's just a little tiny core of it which is still kind of tough. But it'll all just eventually degrade into the same basic fibrous loose material. So the feeding was down the middle last time we came in here. I guess lately I've been just going right for the middle and feeding, and then at the end when we get around to covering up, I normally save the examination of the outer edges to last. You know what, before we go too much further, I don't really see any flying insects in here, so I'm not too worried about it, but I usually use my Mosquito Dunks BTI solution as a, not only a way to combat and get rid of flying insects, but nowadays I've been wondering if I'd just be better off occasionally spritzing each of my systems each time I come in, just as a preventative measure, just so none of the flying insects get any bright ideas and try to move in. So all the stuff we collected on the top surface, we'll give that stuff a little bit of a treatment too. So my guess is if any insects are starting to try to make their home in here, that top layer of material is probably where they're hanging out and where they're laying their eggs and whatnot. So we'll just try to remember to give the whole system a nice little treatment on the top surface, which is where I usually assume that the problem is, and then proceed to the maintenance of the bin. Here we're finding a couple slower composting food items they must have received a while ago. I've got some more of this for them too. It's really chopped up into small bits though, like so, which I believe should help with the slight acceleration of the breakdown of the material. Here's another one. And I wouldn't be surprised if we bumped into another one or more of them, because it is one of the more common things that I feed in the summertime. Usually I just snap the cob in half like so, rather than going to all that extra trouble of hacking it up into little pieces. All those little pieces were from the beginning of the summer, when I figured I would try to establish a new standard for breaking down the corn cobs by chopping them into little bits to help the breakdown process, and then I got tired of it quick and didn't do it after the first go around. So down here we saw a fair number of European night crawlers hanging out down here together. I thought I saw like a juicier piece of food. Maybe it was a tomato or something. I think it was the skin of it that I saw. Or maybe it was that pepper. I knew that I had a rotting pepper that went into one of the systems, and it may have been this one. Or maybe both of them got something along those lines, but whatever it was, it sure seemed to draw some attention. Maybe it was this. Maybe it was like a rotting cherry tomato out of my garden. All right, yep, here's another one. That might be it, though. I've gone pretty thoroughly through the... No, I guess not. I spoke too soon once again. Good number of leftover chunks of corn cob here. 6 of them. Ah, this is bread. Okay. I remember I had a hard roll that was starting to get moldy, and then I broke it in half to be able to give each of the systems one of them. So it seems like that's still showing up as leftovers here in the bin. More little bits of corn cob. I'm pretty sure that that's what this is. There seems to be some paper stuck to it. I don't know, not sure. I don't feed bread very often, so I'm not good at recognizing it when I bump into it as leftovers in my bins. But I do remember feeding a couple halves of hard roll. One of the halves of the hard roll went into each of these 2 systems we're feeding today. This is weird. Some sort of really fibrous stuff. And it just seems to go on and on. I wonder what this is. It's tough. I wonder if I somehow managed to get some sort of a synthetic material in here by accident. It just seems so big. I wonder what its original form was. How did I miss it? How did it end up in here? It wouldn't break, so I'm assuming it's something that isn't going to break down either, so I just removed it, assuming that it's not a compostable material. I did actually feed a number of those colorful napkins last time too, but I don't think that that's the culprit either. I'm going to have to watch the video again and see if I can spot what it was that went in here. That might have explained what that stuff was. Okay. Now I've got my squirt bottle here. You know, not only the one with the BTI mosquito dunks solution in it, but I've also got my high volume sprayer here. And I didn't know if I might need to break that out in order to try to compensate for some of these dry materials we're putting in here. So I think we've already, administered enough of the BTI solution into here to be effective in terms of a preventative measure against flying insects making themselves at home in here. But I also want to make sure I don't allow these dry materials that I'm putting in here to begin sucking up all the moisture in the system. So I'm just going to break out my high-speed water applicator here. Save my little finger the trouble of having to pump all that liquid. And, you know, besides, that stuff has the BTI in it, which doesn't need to be administered in great amounts, I don't think. So I think we'll just go ahead and spray a little bit of that onto the top surface materials, which is where I usually assume the insects are making themselves at home, if they're even there, or would make themselves at home there if they were going to try to move in. So as a preventative measure, it seems like the right place to put it, but, you know, generic moistening of the material in the bin, I think we could handle this way. I've also bought a few days worth of coffee here inside this carton. So why don't we throw a little bit of that in here, spread it around, and something I usually like to combine with the coffee is a little bit of my worm chow. Yeah, but worm chow and coffee is a little bit boring. Let's bring in the regular foods that they're going to be getting. So each one of them is going to get half of this banana peel. So that other half is for the other system. I've got a pear here. It's been cut in half, so each system will get a half of the pear. I got a couple limes here that weren't looking too good, and since they're not really broken or anything or cut open or anything like that, I took my knife and I drilled a little hole into, 2 little holes into each of them, there and on the opposite side. So I've already got this nice lime smell wafting around my wormery here, which I really like. And then we'll just give them a few pieces of this chopped up corn cob. Alrighty. Yeah, I think we've left enough. Pretty much an even split of the food supply for both systems to get. And the other thing that I usually like to add with my food, not all the time, but sometimes, it's the grit that the worms need to be able to break down the foods that they're trying to eat. And for a system that's already had 8 feedings over the past 100 days, this being the 9th feeding, I probably applied this stuff on a number of occasions already. So it's not like they're desperate for the stuff, but I just like to cover all my bases once in a while and just make sure I'm putting it in just in case I've had that same thinking a few times in a row and might not have applied it recently. Every now and then I'll just throw a little bit of grit in there. And I've still got 2 more napkins to go before we can start covering up and checking out the outsides of the system. Let's get that in here too, and we'll dampen it nicely before covering it up. This way we you know, don't have to worry that it's going to be acting as sort of a sponge, drawing all the surrounding moisture into itself. I think that'll work pretty nicely. Oops, there I go again. Not paying attention. I just saw a little cocoon down here. I don't know if it shows up. It's on the tip of my thumb there. But as I went to reach for it, I went ahead and I jammed the end of my little nozzle into the bedding. Let's see if I can get it cleaned off before we proceed. All right. I think that's everything I had intended to apply down into the feeding area, and it's a good bit of stuff. So I think we could just move on to backfilling the feeding area. And as long as we're at it, we're going to take a little peek around the outer edges to see how things look. Moisture is definitely good down here, and it's pretty much castings only. I mean, there's still bits of bedding scattered throughout it, so it's not completely barren of stuff for them to chew on. So that's pretty cool. Like I said, 100 days, it seems like a pretty good mix of, you know, residual bedding and stuff like that floating around, but also lots and lots of castings starting to pile up, which is cool. Let's check out how this other side's looking. Similar. This would be just like a lump of paper or something that maybe we can spread out a bit and give it a better chance of getting broken down rather than leaving it in a clump. What do we got over here? Pretty much more of the same. Things look really nice in here. I wasn't quite sure what to expect as far as moisture goes. I'm usually pretty confident when I'm covering with stuff like newspaper and plastic on top of that. I guess if it was newspaper only, it wouldn't be doing a whole lot, but I do have some systems that are covered only with a sheet of newspaper. And they do okay, but I do feel sometimes in those systems where, you know, maybe that top surface just gets a little bit too dry just by the porous and, you know, ventilating nature of the paper-only coverings. So, darn it, something I forgot to do. Something I wanted to do, but I forgot to do, but we can probably still squeeze it in here before we cover everything up. Remember, I wanted to put this piece of newspaper to a little bit better use by introducing it down into the system as fresh bedding, and at this point it's just going to kind of go in as a big lump over here. Kind of makes me wonder if that's going to be what draws the worm attention, or is it going to be the napkins and the food. Yeah, maybe both of them will be popular. Here we can take some of this top covering stuff that we encountered along the way, some of this leafy material, which is also bedding, but all the bedding eventually turns into food too, so hopefully they'll like what they've been given. It just feels like I've really built up stuff high here. I'm having a hard time covering it up. But you know, I shouldn't worry because I've got my freshly restocked box of leaves. And even if some of what we put in here is peeking through, like these little bits of orange napkin, I'm not going to sweat it, because right on top of everything is going to come a good portion of leaves. Let's say 1, 2 generous handfuls, maybe even a third one, since it's their 100th day in service. Let's give them a treat, right? I like that appearance of natural stuff on the top surface. And I'm even starting to think that maybe we can try to entice them to hang out up here a little bit more by even dampening the leaves, which I usually don't take a lot of effort to do, but once again, I'm just thinking, rather than allowing this dry stuff to start acting as a sponge and drawing the moisture out of the nice damp bedding and making it into bedding that's no longer nice and damp, let's just compensate a little bit here and add perhaps just enough moisture to make sure that this stuff doesn't start acting as a sponge. And I'm sure it wouldn't suck a whole lot of moisture into itself. I'm sure we'd be in okay shape if we didn't do this, but I also don't see any harm in adding a little bit of moisture. After all, the worms really like it. They're not going to complain. And in addition to this stuff, I was also planning on putting a nice replacement top covering of newspaper to go in the place of what we just recycled as bedding. So that's going to go in here kind of dry too. I mean, I could dampen that as well if I wanted to. I don't know. Should we dampen it? Does it matter? Yeah, what the heck. The spray bottle's here. So it doesn't take a lot of water to dampen a sheet of newspaper this size, so let's just go for it. Alright. So, I think we've got ourselves a pretty good template to follow, since we're going to be doing more or less the same thing in the second bin. A lot of times I usually treat the first of 2 or the first of 3 or the first of multiple bins that I'm managing together as sort of the trial and the proving grounds for what I want to do, and make sure what I want to do is something that works well in practice when I get around to actually doing it. But if we follow suit with what we did here in the other one, we can sort of just use this as a template to follow and maybe pick up the pace. So let's go get the other bin. So, alright, on to bin number 2. So, hopefully what we find in here is much of the same like we saw in the last one. Just make sure I'm not bringing any wormies along for a ride on the plastic here. Well, you know what? We'll just take this piece of paper off and just kind of drape it over that piece of plastic in case there are any worms hanging out on it. Shelter them from the light and make sure they don't feel like they've got to go running for shelter. And, well, it looks like here we actually had a feeding zone indicator to indicate to ourselves where the last feeding was. I'm not sure if the last system had it too. It might have been on the, might have actually been stuck to that piece of newspaper. But since we don't have it in the other one, maybe this go around we'll simply eliminate it, and then on the next go around we can restore it. In most cases it's easy enough to figure out where you last fed. Even if you can't figure it out, you can just do a little bit of searching and track it down pretty readily. So before we go too much into disturbing the material that was out here on the top surface, let's give it a shot of the BTI bacteria, just in case. Not that I think that there's any reason to be concerned, but it just seems like if there are any wise guy flying insects that have already made themselves at home in here and I just didn't notice it, then that's where their eggs would probably be. I just can't seem to avoid the distraction of checking out cocoons when I spot them. There's a really bright colored one. When it's really light in color like this one here that you see on my fingertip, it's one that was placed into the bin pretty recently, and then it gets darker and darker as it ages. So we'll do what we did before. We'll just apply the feeding, and then we can examine the outer edges of the system. I'm pretty sure we applied a very similar setup into both bins last time. But here I'm actually starting to see leftovers of the bright orange napkins we used. Oh no, I'm sorry, I'm mistaken. They must have gotten a nice tomato here. That's what that is. I think I had a few tomatoes in my garden that were just not doing too good, so they ended up becoming worm food. But this here, I believe, is actually leftover paper. Some of the bedding they got last time, napkins. I just caught a whiff of something that is a little bit unpleasant. Not gonna panic. Usually the foods that you give your worms is, you know, somehow loses its scent, whatever its scent may have been, in the worm bin. But other things manage to hang on to their scent somehow. But then again, whatever that was, it just sort of came and went. It was just sort of snuck into my nose for a moment and then it vanished just as quickly, so maybe there's no real reason for concern. Kind of just makes me if it could possibly be the bread. So here's that piece of bread, I believe. Seems like paper and things attached to the piece of bread pretty easily. I think that's what we're dealing with here. Unless it's more tomato skins. Well, whatever it is, just gets chalked up to be leftovers, and it's not going to dissuade me from giving them more food today. I mean, you know, on day 100, don't they deserve a nice little treat to commemorate the hard work they've done over the past 100 days? I think so. This is the stem of a pumpkin, which seems to be doing quite nicely. It's very tempting to want to just kind of split this in half, which would probably help its breakdown process, but I usually like to watch how those sort of slow composting, especially something like that's a very, very slow composting thing. I just prefer to just watch it break down on its own without any help. So I'll usually just check it out, set it aside, and let the worms have back at it just the way I found it. Unless I accidentally chip off a bit of it, which occasionally happens, but you know, it's somehow more interesting just to see what the worms are able to make of it over time. So here it does seem like there were more of these little hacked up bits of corn cob. They're really obvious when you touch one, the way it feels, you know, the way it sort of feels like a little donut almost when the middle's already been kind of nibbled out. And they break pretty readily. But even if we don't break them down, the worms will. Although every little you know, what do you call it, I guess, subdivision of an object exposes more and more of its surface that was previously hidden by the object being whole, and all that newly exposed material, now suddenly it gets to be fair game for worm action versus just being concealed by the object being whole still. So there's always kind of an advantage to breaking things up a little bit when you handle them, but I sometimes deliberately avoid doing so for the reasons I gave earlier. So, all right, we're now in a position, I believe, to apply today's feeding. Hopefully we've opened ourselves up a large enough space to fit it all in. And I think we'll follow suit with what we did earlier. Except, you know what, maybe we'll change things up just by making the orange napkins the ones that go on the bottom and the white and yellow one go on top. As if it really made any difference, right? Variety is the spice of life, they say, right? And, you know what, before I forget, this will just be the other sort of twist, is that we're going to actually remember to put this piece of newspaper in rather than have to do it as an afterthought. But we'll kind of slide it in here alongside, similar to the way the other one was positioned. And then I think we can begin in with the, yeah, let's not forget to dampen all this paper. So cool how this thing is able to just pump water, 1, 2, 3, right out in no time. If I were to try to apply that much water with my little hand squirted finger pump bottle, I'd be here for probably 2 or 3 minutes trying to get that much water in here. So it's certainly a time saver from that perspective. I mean, I already feel like I'm at the level of this stuff over here. But we're going to do our best to try to cover things up the way we did in the other one. It seems to be a similar portion of the coffee plus the worm chow. Very nice, very nice. And then, if I remember correctly, on top of that went all the yummy kitchen scraps, like they got in the other one. It's half of a banana peel, the half of a pear. Each bin got a lime, as well as a few more of these corncob discs. All right, very nice. I just feel compelled to sort of squash things down a little bit to minimize the height of the stuff so that it doesn't try to protrude out the top surface when we cover up here. So I think before we covered up with paper, we went ahead and we also sprinkled a little bit of my crushed eggshell onto the food that they're getting as grit. And that'll just help with the breakdown process of the foods that they're given. And then we can just cap off the feeding with these last couple of napkins. Very nice. I mean, as far as moisture goes, I think we're in pretty good shape here. I think both systems seem to have an ample amount of moisture. I guess that's the wonder of having plastic as your top covering. Sort of minimizes any concerns of the system drying out. I mean, I do here and there run my systems, a couple of my systems with only paper coverings, and in those systems I do come back to the system and, you know, the top covering is pretty much dry. You know, not too surprising. And then I feel like I've got to compensate, so I might actually switch up those systems to have plastic coverings as well. Most of my systems have plastic coverings to protect against evaporation and undue drying. And that just, you know, ensures a whole lot more worm traffic out on the top surface and doesn't allow it to get dry and uncomfortable for the worms. So let's just aerate this outer edge too. Not only am I kind of inspecting it and checking it out for castings density, it's also my chance to sort of till it up a bit and make sure it's got a nice amount of air in it. But it also gives us a glimpse of how many worms are hanging out in the stuff. It seems like even though the feedings have been put in, you know, getting placed down the center, the worms feel just as content to be on the outer edges of the system. Because I guess as long as the material still has scraps of paper and leaves and food scraps and whatever, they're, you know, they're going to find food even though they don't go to where the big mob scene is, where the large amount of food is. Let's see how things on this edge look. Similar, perhaps not quite as densely populated, but still damp enough that worms are there and comfortable in it, it seems. Otherwise they wouldn't be there, I don't believe. Pretty cool. I'll just make sure I get a chance to sort of aerate that over there too a bit. Loosen things up. Make sure nothing's becoming kind of tight and compacted like a big mound. If I run into any sort of clumps of paper or bedding that's sort of sticking together there too, I have a chance to sort of break it apart a bit and spread it out. Make sure it all has a fair chance of getting the attention that it needs from the worms to get broken down. All right, things are looking good in here. Both systems look really nice if you ask me. So before we cover up with the replacement top covering of newspaper, I'm going to drop in a similar amount of dry leaves here across the top surface and dampen it like we did before. There we go. Very nice. Bring in the magic wand. This is also my chance to sort of tidy up the outer edges of the bin as well as my glove while I'm at it. I mean, better to leave these castings that are stuck to my glove in the bin rather than rinse them down the sink when I go to wash off my glove. Okay, not bad. Not bad at all. Okay, and like we did before, I guess we could do the same thing as we could take this top covering of paper and also make sure it's nice and damp too. Kind of unusual the way the water just beads on some of this paper over here. Kind of makes me wonder why. I always thought that the inks that are used on this newspaper are like soy-based and stuff that the worms can easily compost. But when I see water beading up, it makes me wonder if maybe there's some other sort of coating on there. But hopefully it's just, I don't know, something else. Something that's not going to impede breakdown of materials or anything like that. But then again, it's a top covering for now. It'll have plenty of time to get broken down. At some point, this will probably get used as bedding too, but for the time being, it's just top covering. So I believe that brings us to the end of today's check-in with our now 100-day-old systems that have the European night crawlers in them. Feeding number 9 going in after 8 days since the last feeding. And it was a pretty generous feeding and a lot of bedding. Plenty of moisture that we don't have to worry. So, you know, we could probably wait even 2 weeks if we wanted to before we came into these systems to feed again. But I guess that'll just depend on my schedule and how I feel. So we'll just see how that goes. All right, everyone. That's it for today's video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.